This is lecture 10, the Enlightenment, and I'll begin with a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England. Direct us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, obtain everlasting life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Enlightenment was a time primarily associated with the 18th century, but in some ways beginning in the 17th century, in which European intellectuals turned toward reason and away from the authority of the Christian tradition, the Christian church, Christian clergy, and so forth, and emphasized the role of reason in freeing humanity for genuine knowledge. The metaphor, of course, is that through reason, people are being enlightened from the superstitions of tradition. And the Enlightenment led to enormous confidence in what humans could learn and what humans could accomplish through reason. And it became powerful in shaping the outlook of Western elites in the 18th century. I'm going to, in this lecture, talk about a number of key Enlightenment figures who profoundly shaped the West and Western Christianity in ways that are crucial for understanding the rest of this course. But to begin, I want to note some aspects of the context for the Enlightenment, the background, that help us make sense of why it was happening at this time. And keep in mind that most of what I'm talking about here is happening at the same time as the things we talked about in the last lecture. So while pietism and evangelicalism are flourishing and winning many converts in England and the Holy Roman Empire and America, at the same time, the Enlightenment is also picking up steam. And these are different ways that Protestants are responding to modernity and its crises. There are also arguably different ways that Protestants are responding to the kind of the formalism and the lack of faith that people were experiencing in the church because of the crises of modernity. And that led some people to turn to revivals of evangelical faith and an emphasis on individual transformation, while it led others away from doctrinal orthodoxy and towards emphasizing reason. But there were evangelicals who embraced much of the Enlightenment, and there were Enlightenment figures who held to Orthodox Christianity. So you can't pit them completely against each other. There was significant overlap. So background to the Enlightenment, one important thing we've talked about in this class is the background of humanism in the late medieval period. We talked about how humanism called for a return to the original sources in their original languages, and that this gave rise to a more critical way of reading the Bible and of evaluating the claims of traditional authorities, such as the Pope or the Church or the clergy. And this helped launch the Reformation. Therefore, it also helped launch Protestantism, which built on the impulse of humanism by emphasizing the principle of sola scriptura, by rejecting the medieval mode of allegorical interpretation of the Bible, and by calling for humanist-style exegesis. So when the Enlightenment figures come along, they're going to see themselves as building on this legacy of humanism and the Reformation. Another part of the background is dogmatism, which Gonzalez talks about a fair bit. The major traditions of Christianity, Catholicism, Lutheranism, and the Reformed churches, were becoming characterized in some cases by an increasing dogmatism during the 1600s. More and more rigorously, precisely defining doctrines and insisting on them in various disputes. And a growing number of intellectuals and clergy found this to be suffocating, and they found it to be divisive and unhelpful. And this encouraged an anti-clerical, anti-doctrinal impulse. Another key development was the religious wars and the religious persecution that we've talked about, the horrific conflicts of the 1600s, especially the 30 Years' War, which devastated the Holy Roman Empire, but also the Dutch War for Independence, the English Civil War, and then later the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and the experience of brutal persecution. All these things soured many intellectuals against the comprehensive claims of religion or religious authorities to control and order society. And it encouraged skepticism toward dogmatic Christian claims and skepticism toward the close association of the church and political power. So that's another thing feeding the Enlightenment. Also going on at this time was the development of nationalism. States were emerging as a powerful counterpoint to religious authority. And many Enlightenment figures would see powerful political rulers who put the interests of the nation first, above any particular religious group, as being the ideal that would lead toward the progress of reason and enlightenment. Along with that, thanks to various economic developments, trade, education, there was a growing middle class. And the middle class found itself much better off, much more educated than the mass of the sort of the common people, the peasants, and so desiring more influence, desiring more authority, and yet finding that it had relatively little power compared to, say, the nobility and the monarchies of Europe. And so the middle class became more and more eager to assert itself and its rights and to overthrow long-standing feudal privileges held by the church and held by the nobility and other traditional structures. And the middle class increasingly found an ally in political leaders who wanted to strengthen the state, also at the expense of traditional authorities. So there's a natural alliance between politicians who want to weaken the nobility and weaken the church to strengthen the state. They have a natural alliance with middle class who also want to weaken the traditional authorities in order to strengthen their own hand. And so this surge of nationalism of the middle class, and then there's these Enlightenment figures who think this might also be the pathway to the growing influence of reason at the expense of superstition, dogma, tradition, and so forth. Groups that tended to be especially interested in the Enlightenment often included Jews, because they had always been kind of outcasts from Christian authorities, but also Huguenots, because they were still experiencing religious persecution in France. And so among Jews and Huguenots, some of these trends were especially pronounced. An early key figure in the Enlightenment is René Descartes. He's well known. He had been a veteran of the 30 Years' War, so he knew all about that. And then he later lived in the Netherlands, where there was an unusually high level of toleration. And there he found it necessary to question every single authority that he could. And he went through a process of disciplined skepticism or disciplined doubt, trying to doubt everything he possibly could in order to determine what was certain, what he could not doubt. And on that, he hoped to build a foundation for true knowledge rather than relying on the authorities of the past. In the end, he found himself able to doubt everything except one thing. I think, therefore I am. In other words, he couldn't doubt his own existence. And on the basis of that, he tried to rebuild a system of thought that could lead to genuine knowledge. This embodies various aspects of the Enlightenment, including its willingness to reject all authority, its emphasis on radical reason, but also its turn to the self as the true authority. And that's the key to understanding a lot of what happens in modernity. So a growing number of intellectuals, like René Descartes, rejected traditional authorities, including the church and clergy, and attempted to establish new ways of thinking grounded on human reason. They questioned, for instance, the Genesis story of human origins. They questioned the miracles found in the Bible. Theology, which had always been the queen of the sciences in Western Christian education, was shoved aside in favor of other disciplines. The Enlightenment figures saw themselves as driving human progress, and they developed enormous confidence and optimism in what was possible. Because they saw themselves as throwing off superstition, they saw themselves as unshackling the human race, freeing it from intellectual slavery. Ironically, this very confidence and optimism borrowed from the Christian belief in the coming kingdom, and especially growing Christian confidence in millennialism. We talked about that in the last lecture, that a growing number of Christians at this time believed that the world would become more and more Christian, preceding Christ's return. And Enlightenment figures shared in that same confidence, except they thought that reason would lead to this sort of progress. Many Enlightenment figures believed in a benevolent creator, and they did consider themselves kind of broadly Christian. They had a high view of humanity as made in God's image, and they took ideas of Christian theology and tried to eliminate the finer doctrinal points, a lot of the supernatural stuff, but maintain a lot of the ethical impulses and what they thought was best and most hopeful about Christianity, all in the name of reason. Some of them became deists, maintaining their belief in a benevolent and wise creator while rejecting traditional Christian doctrines that suggested that this creator was personally involved with creation. They viewed him more like a watchmaker who brilliantly designs a watch but then leaves it to work for itself. Others, however, became much more hostile to religion. For example, a Portuguese Jew named Baruch de Spinoza, who lived in Amsterdam, notice also the tie to the Netherlands, wrote, "The supreme mystery of despotism, or tyranny, its prop and stay, is to keep men in a state of deception, and with the specious title of religion, to cloak the fear by which they must be held in check, so that they will fight for their servitude as if for salvation, and count it no shame, but the highest honor, to spend their blood and their lives for the glorification of one man." In other words, what he's saying is that tyranny uses religion to convince people to devote themselves to the service of others in ways that lead to their own enslavement. It's sort of an early version of the claim later made famous by Karl Marx that religion is the opiate of the masses. Now, we don't have the time to go into the specifics of the Enlightenment debates regarding knowledge, which spurred competing approaches such as rationalism and empiricism, and later helped foster the scientific method. Gonzalez does a good job summarizing this. What I want to do is identify a few key figures and ideas that powerfully shaped modernity and Christianity moving forward. The first few that I want to look at are concerned with politics. Thomas Hobbes had lived through the English Civil Wars that we talked about a while back, and he came to dread the violence and chaos and disorder that he saw tearing England apart. And he blamed the Puritans and their clergy and their theology. In particular, he rejected their two kingdoms theology, especially the claim that God gives authority to the church that cannot be usurped by the state. Hobbes came to believe that wherever there's competing authority, there will be conflict. And so he worked out a theory rooted in reason that gave all power to the state, which he named after the mythical biblical creature Leviathan. Hobbes is a good reminder that the Enlightenment didn't necessarily lead to and had no inevitable connection to democracy or republicanism, because for Hobbes, he saw the path to reason and stability being through an all-powerful state. Another key English figure in the 17th century was John Locke, and this picture before you is John Locke. He lived at the time of the Glorious Revolution. He had also experienced the English Civil Wars more in his youth, but he came to a very different set of conclusions from Hobbes. For Locke, the primary threat wasn't violence and division. The primary threat was tyranny. And Locke's philosophizing launched the political tradition known as liberalism or political liberalism. Yet today, many people treat Locke simply as a secular philosopher, forgetting that he rooted his philosophy in traditional Christian doctrines. He wasn't a dogmatist, but he did hold to certain core convictions of Christian orthodoxy, without which his arguments in favor of political liberalism could not have stood. For example, he argued that no person has natural mastery over another person because all people are made in the image of God and subject to God alone. And thus, Locke argued, in their natural state, or what he called a state of nature, all people are free and equal. They possess basic rights, natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and no one has the right to deny them of those rights without their consent. For Locke, marriage and family were part of this state of nature, but significantly, government was not. Government was not a natural institution. And to protect their rights from violence from others, their life, liberty, and property, Locke argued, people come together freely to protect each other and enforce basic justice. They enter into a contract, a social contract, to form civil governments. What's essential is that they do this by their consent, because there can be no legitimate government without consent. Furthermore, they don't give civil government unlimited authority. Rather, they give it specific delegated powers, limited by law, in order that it might protect their basic rights to life, liberty, and property, and not usurp them. But if the government fails to protect these rights, or if it usurps these rights, if it becomes tyrannical, the people reserve and always maintain the right to overthrow that authority, like the English did in the Glorious Revolution. And Locke clearly is thinking of that sort of situation. Here, Locke was developing older Christian ideas about the rule of law, about resistance to tyranny, and about human rights, and taking them in new directions. He also developed two kingdoms theology, arguing that the concerns of religion and politics are fundamentally distinct. He argued that the basic mark of Christianity is charity or love, which he said requires that people not persecute others without just cause. And since religion is a matter of conscience, he said, the state has no right to interfere with it. Therefore, he limited the concerns of the state to temporal affairs or matters that pertain to the body, arguing that these should be sharply distinguished from matters that pertain to the soul. And only if religion leads a person to violate the rights of others or deny the authority of the government should that person suffer punishment. So he didn't argue for religious liberty for everyone. For instance, he defended the persecution of Roman Catholics, since he said Catholics pledged allegiance to the Pope over and above the English government, and therefore they couldn't be trusted as good citizens. He also argued against religious liberty for atheists, because he argued that because they don't believe in God, they have no foundation to affirm basic human morality and government. They can't be trusted, because if they don't believe in a God who will defend right and wrong, then why would they have any incentive to do right or instead of wrong? As we'll see, Locke's ideas and the ideas of others like him had a profound effect on America's founding fathers. But it's important to see how Christian they were. Locke was taking old Christian ideas and applying them in a way that promoted liberty and limited government. And that meant that the new tradition that was emerging, political liberalism, was at that point what you could properly call Christian political liberalism. In it, human rights or natural rights and the system of political theory that held governments accountable to protect those rights came from a belief in humanity's creation in the image of God. Now, if Locke represents a sort of moderately Christian political liberalism, a more radical Enlightenment philosophy was emerging in France in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as well as other figures like Voltaire, Diderot, and so forth. These figures sharply criticized Christianity, especially the militant and dogmatic Catholicism that had arisen in France. And I think it's no accident that the more radical Enlightenment does come from France, where there's, a lot of these intellectuals come to be disgusted at the Catholic Church. Rousseau argued that nearly every element of human society and culture had become oppressive and unjust. In order to offer a radical critique of that society, Rousseau proposed rejecting all theological and historical authorities in favor of viewing human beings the way they were in their natural state, or what he, like Locke, called their state of nature. In this state, he argued, human beings would have had no property, no society, no authority, no family ties, no developed religion. Notice the difference from Locke, who believed that religion, marriage, family, things like that were in the state of nature. Rousseau says, no, all you would have had in the state of nature was individuals living in the wild, almost like a noble savage type idea. He says people wouldn't have even been aware that sex led to the procreation of children. And he argued that the first step towards oppression had been the establishment of property. That moment when he said, the first person took a patch of ground and said, mine. And from there, he argues, people developed culture and authority, often for oppressive purposes, to protect their power over against others. Now, Rousseau's point in all this was not that we should go back to the state of nature, but that since society is entirely a human construction, then humans have the freedom to deconstruct it, or tear it down and reconstruct it afresh. He viewed education as the key to doing this. By educating rational people to pursue the common good, humans could build a new just system. And he thought that as enlightened people reasoned and argued together, they would reach a consensus he called the general will, which was more important than what any individual thought. This general will would be embodied in government and law. But unlike Locke, Rousseau did not emphasize individual rights or the rule of law as a limit on what the general will could do. Rather, he said, whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be constrained to do so by the whole body, which means nothing other than that he shall be forced to be free. Rousseau argued that society needs to establish a new civil religion that arises from reason alone. And he argued that society needs to censor and suppress views and writings that run contrary to the general will. He shared in the general optimism about what the future would bring, but as you can see, Rousseau, in some ways more like Hobbes, although not completely, he also is using reason to defend ideas that aren't particularly conducive of freedom or democracy, although they're also anti-traditional or anti-monarchical. So those are some of the political figures that are significant for the Enlightenment. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble shifting to the different images that I have. For whatever reason, my screen is not letting me click on the different tabs while I'm in this Zoom meeting. So you're going to have to do so on your own by clicking on the links. But the next area I want to look at is economics. And here the key figure is Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, or what we might call market economics. In 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. And his understanding of economics, as embodied in this book, revolutionized the modern world. Up to that point, the reigning economic system was mercantilism. Mercantilism called for a high level of government regulation and control of trade, with the purpose of ensuring that all trade benefited the home country at the expense of its rivals. Wealth was seen as a pie of fixed size. If one nation gained a larger piece of the pie, another would necessarily have less. And thus mercantilism led the major European powers like Britain and France and Spain and the Netherlands to try to exclude one another from trade. Now, Smith believed that a benevolent God had made the world according to certain natural laws, and that it would run best when left to run according to these laws. He argued that there will be far more economic prosperity for everyone if the market is left free. Workers would then be free to move and work where they could get the best pay. Investors would be free to invest in products for which there was the most demand. People would be free to purchase or pay for what they most needed. Supply would respond to demand, and goods and services and labor would move where they were most needed. The need for efficiency would drive a division of labor and technological improvement in ways that made societies far more prosperous than ever before. The rich would get richer, but so would the poor. And thus the poorest person in a developing market society would be better off than even the wealthiest were a few centuries ago. The system would flourish as if it were directed by an invisible hand. Over time, the influence of Smith and those who followed his approach led to a shift from competitive mercantilism, defining the way European nations interacted with each other, toward free trade. And this was especially so in countries like Britain and the Netherlands, and as we'll see later, the United States. His predictions proved accurate because free trade became the engine these countries used to pursue unprecedented wealth and power. His predictions were also accurate in the way that trade enhanced prosperity all around the globe, even eventually among the poorest countries. But Smith's system did not eliminate inequality, and it never worked perfectly because, as he himself admitted, the system was never entirely free, and there were always all manner of distortions and disruptions that prevented it from working the way it should have. In some cases, due to market conditions or exploitative systems, people's conditions, economic conditions, would actually grow worse. And so, although in general, the market economy or capitalism was an overwhelming success, because it was not always successful, it would have its critics throughout the centuries. So, Adam Smith and his influence on economics is another key influence of the Enlightenment. Finally, I want to note some shifts in philosophy and theology that will shape Protestantism. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher, son of a minister, who sought to apply the laws of reason to human thought or knowledge. In a revolutionary shift, Kant argued that the mind doesn't process what it perceives objectively, but rather it interprets and orders everything according to certain ideas and categories that it already has. He tried to make space for belief in God, religion, and morality, while discarding traditional assumptions about revelation and authority. He left a permanent stamp on modern philosophy, shifting the focus from what was objective out there, seen as being objective, to what is subjective in the mind. In other words, a shift to the interior, to the self. This led to a combination of rationalism, emphasis on reason, and doubt, skepticism, that profoundly influenced intellectual Protestantism. Okay, so a combination of reason and doubt that will increasingly shape intellectual Protestantism, starting in Germany. Like many other Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, Kant saw the Enlightenment as advancing through the enlightened leadership of monarchs, men like King Frederick the Great of Prussia. Other philosophers established similar relationships with monarchs in Central and Eastern Europe, and these monarchs claimed to organize their states in enlightened ways because they perceived the traditional authorities, like the nobility, as obstacles to their power. And yet these leaders were definitely guided by nationalist goals. The final figure I want us to note is the last of them chronologically, Friedrich Schleiermacher, who actually lived well into the 1800s, and who would become a leading Reformed voice applying Enlightenment principles to Christianity. But Schleiermacher, in part, reacted to the emphasis on reason. He actually prioritized religious consciousness and emotion over rationalism. And part of that is to protect religion from rationalism by saying religion is fundamentally emotion or feeling. But Schleiermacher himself was influenced by the Enlightenment to the point that he rejected or revised much of Orthodox theology, in some ways reducing true religion to the disposition of the heart or feeling, or what became known as Romanticism, which again he thought he was defending true Christianity. And again, this, following Kant, signaled what would become a major shift among academic Protestants, starting in Germany, away from orthodoxy. The Enlightenment's confidence in human nature and human reason, and in the ability of human beings to grasp the laws of the universe and apply them in ways that unleashed progress, came to define the Western outlook, especially of Western elites, during the 1700s and 1800s. It led to a drive for growing knowledge and mastery of the world, rooted in the confidence that through reason and the assertion of a new mode of being guided by that reason, humans could remake society in a way that would be for the good of all. And the Enlightenment did bring, in some ways, substantial progress. But don't forget that its sheer confidence and arrogant dismissal of traditionalism, traditional theology, and sometimes traditional ethics, and its rejection of those people who were deemed irrational also would lead to shocking abuses and ultimately atrocities in colonialism, slavery, and social systems throughout the world. And so, while it's tempting sometimes to look back in the Enlightenment as simply a positive thing, as it saw itself as being, it's also important to see the downsides and the tragedies that came along with Enlightenment philosophy. And as we study developments moving forward, it's no longer just a sort of traditionalism or even a Christian theology that is framing the way people approach things. Now the Enlightenment, for good or for ill, is going to be another aspect that is having a powerful impact on the way Christendom is developing.